Welcome to the Explainer. All right, let's just jump right in with a huge question. Can science actually explain beauty? Today, we're going to dive into this really cool intersection of art, philosophy, and brain science to see how experiments are tackling questions that, for the longest time, seemed totally unanswerable.
For centuries, if you wanted to talk about the big questions in art, you were pretty much talking to a philosopher. It was their turf, a world of deep thought and, abstract reasoning.
And it makes sense, right? Questions like this, they just feel so personal, so subjective. I mean, how could you possibly put something like taste or artistic value under a microscope? It seems impossible. This quote from Wittgenstein, it just nails the whole 20th century vibe. He basically says there's no connection between what a psychologist does and judging a work of art. Aesthetics was seen as this armchair project, right? Something you figure out through logic and deep thought, not by running experiments in a lab. So the thinking was, our connection to art, that's a high-level thing, totally separate from the messy, nitty-gritty science of the mind. But oh boy, that was all about to change. Yeah, over the last few decades, a totally new player has stepped into the ring. And this one comes armed with things like brain scanners, massive data sets, a whole different toolkit for digging into why we feel what we feel about art. And this created a fascinating clash of worlds. So on one side, you've got your traditional philosopher, using reason to figure out the value and meaning of art. And on the other, you have the cognitive scientist, running experiments to explain the actual mechanisms in our brains that drive our preferences. So what happens when you take one of these classic philosophical ideas and, actually test it? Well, sometimes the results are pretty surprising. For instance, a lot of philosophers have argued that when you and I argue about art, deep down, we both believe one of us is right and the other is wrong. But then researchers actually went out and tested this, and what they found was the complete opposite. A massive study, we're talking 19 countries, showed that when people disagree about what's beautiful, almost nobody thinks there's a single right answer. Turns out, most of us are basically relativists about art, which kind of pulls the rug out from under a huge philosophical assumption.
Okay, so if it's not about being right, then what is going on? What's driving our tastes? Well, cognitive science has some ideas, and they suggest the answers might be baked right into the wiring of our brains.
One of the biggest ideas here is something called processing fluency, and it's actually a pretty simple but really powerful concept. It just means our brains like stuff that's easy to process. That's it. When something is easy for our minds to grasp, we get this little subtle feeling of pleasure.
And this effect is everywhere, not just in art. Get this. Studies show that we think statements written in easy-to-read fonts are more true. We think rhyming sayings are more accurate. And yeah, when it comes to art, we often see symmetrical, simple shapes as more beautiful. And why? You guessed it. They're just easier for our brains to handle.
This plugs right into another huge idea from psychology, the mere exposure effect. Basically, the more you see something, the easier it is to process, and the more you tend to like it. This might even help explain why the great works of art stay great works of art, right? We see them all the time, which just makes us like them more. But wait, it's not quite that simple. There was this fascinating study that threw a wrench in the works. They showed people both good art and bad art, as judged by critics. And for the good art, yeah, seeing it more made people like it more. But for the bad art, the more they saw it, the less they liked it. So maybe it's not just that seeing things makes us like them. Maybe it just helps us see their true qualities, good or bad, more clearly.
All right, let's switch gears. What about our obsession with the real thing, with originals? Think about it. A perfect fake can look exactly the same as the original, but we think it's worth way, way less. If you can't tell the difference, what's the big deal?
Well, this is a classic debate in philosophy. You've got one camp, the empiricists, who say, hey, how it looks is all that matters. A perfect fake is just as good. But then you have the contextualists who fire back. No way! The story behind it, who made it, when they made it, that's a huge part of its value. And this is where cognitive science comes in with some really cool ideas for why most of us have that contextualist gut feeling. So one theory is that we value the achievement, the incredible skill it took. Another is this kind of magical idea of contagion, like the artist's essence is literally in the object. And a third one is the effort heuristic, a mental shortcut where our brain just assumes that if something took a long time to make, it must be better. It's these deep down intuitions that make us crave the original. Okay, on to one of my favorite puzzles in all of art. Why do we get so emotional over things we know aren't real? I mean, we cry at movies, we get angry at villains in books. What's up with that? Like, do we really feel sad for Anna Karenina? We know she's not a real person. There's no one to actually feel sorry for. So what in the world is happening inside our heads? So, again, philosophers have a couple of theories. One camp says, yep, it's real emotion. You don't need to believe something exists to feel something about it. But then there's this other idea of quasi-emotions. This theory says it feels like a real emotion, but it's missing a key ingredient. We're not motivated to act. We feel bad for Anna, but we don't, try to stop her from going to the train station.
But if you look at it from a brain science perspective, that distinction might not even matter. Our emotional systems probably didn't evolve to care if a threat is real or imaginary. Reacting to a possible danger is a great survival strategy, right? And fiction, well, it just comes along and hijacks that ancient, powerful system.
And that helps us understand the paradox of tragedy. Why on earth do we actually enjoy art that makes us feel bad? There are a few theories. One is the compensation theory. We put up with the sadness to get a bigger payoff, like some deep insight. Another is the conversion theory, that in the safe space of art, the sadness itself gets flipped into something pleasurable. Or maybe it's the neutrality theory, which says, hey, maybe sadness isn't always a negative thing. Maybe it all just depends on the context. So, where does all this leave us? Is science just explaining away the magic of art, reducing it to a bunch of brain chemicals? No, not at all. I think the real story here is about a new kind of collaboration. Look at it this way. Science can explain how an impressionist painting shimmers. It can tell us it's because of how different parts of our visual system process color. That's the mechanism, but philosophy is what helps us ask about the meaning of that shimmer, the aesthetic experience itself. When you put these two worlds together, the why from philosophy and the how from science, you don't destroy art. You get a much deeper, more complete picture of it. We're not just reducing beauty to a brain scan, we're getting a richer understanding of why art means so much to us as human beings. Which leaves us with a pretty big question to chew on. If we can explain exactly how our reaction to art works, does that change the experience itself? Something to think about.